Booktrib, the leading source for book news and book reviews. I read it. It's a great newsletter. It doesn't cost anything. You can just subscribe. Today, we're here with Otho Eskin, and he has written just a terrific political thriller or political crime novel, because there's a difference, called The Reflecting Pool. A totally objective review in the Providence Journal summed up the book this way. The Reflecting Pool is a crime thriller constructed along classic lines. And in Zorn, Marco Zorn, the hero, Eskin has created the best crime hero this side of Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch. Woven from the fabric of masters like John D. MacDonald and Robert Crace, this riveting page-turner is never afraid to cut its own cloth. I don't know who that reviewer was, Otho, but he was spot on. Welcome to Facebook Live, sponsored by Booktrib.
Delighted to be here and delighted to meet with you, John.
It's nice to be here. You look fantastic. I like the shirt and the flooring. They go. Everything is. You could be on one of the news stations right now talking politics, which you could do because that's your actual background. But I was hooked by The Reflecting Pool from literally the first paragraph, and I want to prove that point by reading it. She looks at me through 3 feet of water. Rose, I ask. As a homicide detective, I see the faces of the dead all the time. This one is different. I remember those blue eyes, but that can't be possible. So I think in comparing you to authors, I should have added Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, because that feels like their great crime novels of the 40s and 50s. Here's my first question. With that in mind, have you created a new genre here we might call Washington Noir?
I love that term. I hadn't occurred to me to use that, but it's a great idea and a great question. I think what most people think of as Washington are the monuments, the bureaucrats, the politicians, all the lovely buildings, the museums. But there's another whole side of Washington, which I try to explore, both sides actually. And I try to introduce some of the elements of what you described as crime noir in both sides of Washington, both the public side, the publicly known city, and the city of crime, of drugs, of guns, and violence. So I like that idea of Washington Noir.
You know, and continuing with that, I mean, this is classic. The sky in the east is getting bright when I finish my drink, and I'm beginning to see the outlines of a plan to get out of this mess. It will be dangerous, but it's the only way. When you think about hard-boiled crime novels, and I'm so glad you liked my reference of Washington Noir, authors take ownership of cities. Robert Parker took ownership of Boston with Spencer. Chandler took ownership of LA with or the Raymond Chandler novels took ownership there. Many people say Lawrence Block took ownership of New York with Matthew Scudder. No one has ever taken Washington as the setting for this kind of series. No one has ever exploited the city for this kind of book, this kind of series, as they have other cities. What do you think accounts for that? Why have people avoided Washington as a setting for noir?
Well, I think most people, as I say, associate Washington with politicians and bureaucrats, which are hopelessly boring crowd of people. So it doesn't lend itself to violence and darkness. So but in fact, they do. I think Washington, I've lived and worked in Washington for many, many years, and I've seen up close the bitter turf fights and struggles among and between government agencies. But then there's a whole side of Washington that nobody who comes to Washington and just sees it from the tour bus window actually sees. And that's very much a part of Washington. For many years, Washington was referred to as the murder capital of the country. And there were, until recently, open drug markets within sight of the capital itself. And it is still, can be, or parts of the city, a very violent city with guns and drugs and a lot of very dangerous people. There are people that I know who won't go into that part of the city after dark if they can help it. So and people just don't know that Washington as well, but it lends itself to a noir treatment.
Well, speaking of knowing Washington well, you are, it would be an insult to call you a Washington insider because of the connotations of that these days. But
Yes, right.
you're a lawyer, you're a former diplomat, you've served in the US Army, United States Foreign Service. You have been vice chairman of the US delegation for the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. You participate in negotiations for the ISS, the International Space Station. You've been the US representative to the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. You're active now. You're also active, and we're going to get to this later, in the Washington theater scene. You're a playwright. You're like a Renaissance man. But here's my question: how did your experience working in Washington inform and inspire your work in the Reflecting Pool?
Well, as I say, I've worked the bureaucratic side of Washington for many years as part of my career and as a lawyer beforehand. So I drew on that, but I wanted to draw on the other part of Washington. Now, I can't claim that I know any murderers or drug dealers personally. I hope not, but I don't. I wanted to. That's my imagination, but I know the city physically. I've been through it. I've stayed at people's houses and in the parts of the city which are crime ridden, and I have never been to a drug market, not to my knowledge. But I've seen them, and I've seen the drug dealers on the street corner selling their goods. So that's all fed into it. But I also wanted to, I just mentioned in passing that I also spent a lot of my time abroad. I worked in New York and in Geneva with the United Nations. I've worked went to school in Paris, and I've served in U.S. embassies. And my last one was in East Germany and in Berlin, where I was a political counselor. And none of that revealed anything about Washington's criminal past, but I do have a sense of cities all over the world, and I think I've drawn on all of that to try to create, in my imagination, a complex polyglot environment.
I think you did. Washington becomes a character in the book, the way LA does in Raymond in Philip Marlowe. And I saw things in this book about Washington, places and settings I never knew existed. Now, and I write the Capital Crime series, Margaret Truman's Capital Crime series now. So you would think I would have a pretty good knowledge of Washington. So what I'm wondering is, of all those out of the way, off the beaten path underbelly of Washington, you mentioned like the drug markets. Besides the drug markets, Otho, what were one or two of the other settings that you had the most fun writing about, that letting people know existed that they might not have known existed before?
Well, on the criminal side, Marco Zorn, my protagonist, has to deal with the head of a large criminal gang who is a 98-year-old woman who is as tough as nails, even tougher than he is. And so that, of course, is purely imaginary. But I also deal with the highest levels of government, including the White House. I've been to the White House, not in a very important role, I must say, but I know the inside, and I wanted to show how that looks in contrast to the headquarters of a crime lord or lady in Washington.
You know, let's talk about Zorn, Marco Zorn, the hero, because you've done something remarkable in the reflecting pool in this, that in typical noir, the hero operates outside the system by nature. He might have been an ex-cop, but he might be an ex-cop, but he's no longer, he's persona non grata. And that defines his very being. It defines his, or in some cases, her essence now. But Zorn is a homicide detective, and yet he's still operating outside the system. He's kind of a dark character, and yet he's not, because he's the moral center of the story. And I found him to be fascinating. And there was, all characters like him have a relationship with the author, in the sense that you're his creator, and yet there is a side of him that you can't control, as none of us can when we fashion a hero that we love. Tell us something you want readers and potential readers to know about Marco Zorn, and what it is about him that makes us root for him, why we want him to win in spite of his flaws and his foibles.
Well, as you say, he is a homicide detective, and he's a very good homicide detective. He closes a lot of cases that other people fail to do. But he is also a man who does not like rules. He makes up his own rules as he goes along, and he's very impatient with authority. He does not like to be told what to do if he thinks it's wrong. And he's very tough. He's distinguished in one way, is that he does not like violence, and he does not like guns, and he just rarely carries a gun. But when he has to, he does and uses it. And he can be very violent if it's necessary to protect himself and to achieve his ends. He has a sardonic sense of humor, and he uses that on people he doesn't like, which are a lot of people in the government. But he's also has a side to him. He's very sentimental and feeling for people who are underprivileged or are in trouble, and who he cares about people like that. And he's almost, as I say, sentimental about some people who are in trouble, and he will go way out of his way, including to the point of risking his own life, to help them.
You know, that, which brings me perfectly to the next question. I'm a big title maven. I love titles, and titles that have come from this genre, you know, have so much meaning, whether it be the Maltese Falcon, whether it be Farewell, My Lovely. The Reflecting Pool is the perfect title for this book. Obviously, there is a reflecting pool in Washington, but am I right that your choice of that title, was as much the perfect, it felt to me like a metaphor, that a reflecting pool is, you can see your reflection in it. You can see who you really are. And there is so much in this story about getting to the guts of who people really are, including Zorn, because Zorn comes to grips with a lot of things in his own right. So tell me if the Reflecting Pool was a metaphor, or was it just a great title you chose because it would look great on the cover?
Well, I wish I could say that I had thought of what you described. I think it's an excellent question, and I've giving it some thought. I do think it's a metaphor in the sense that the reflecting pool reflects Washington, the city of Washington, and all what's good about it, if there is any, and what's bad about it. To be honest with you, it never occurred to me that it would reflect the true personalities. But now that you mentioned it, I think that's a great idea, and I love it.
Are you, you know, it's interesting because I think you indicated that Marco Zorn is going to stick around, that this is going to be a series, right?
That's correct. Yes, I've already written the sequel.
Well, which not a question I had on my list, but I'm curious. Are you branding the series by calling every book after a location in Washington? Where are we going next? What's the next title?
The next title is not is Headshot, and so it has nothing to do with a monument or a feature of architecture. It has to do with shooting and actually photography.
But we still have Marco Zorn.
We still have Marco Zorn. He's unchanged, unregenerated, just as bad as he is in the reflecting pool.
You know, I am struck in those two passages I read. The cadence of it isn't dialogue, but it is, because it's internal monologue, because the whole book is told through Zorn's POV. It's first person. So not only does the dialogue itself with quotation marks crackle with a life and a vigor and a rhythm a la that reminded me of Elmore Leonard at times, but it also, even in the internal monologues, I enjoyed those as much. I once said to Lee Child, who's a very good friend thanks to international thriller writers, I told him how much I enjoyed the new Reacher book, and I thought it was one of my favorites because it went back to first person. And he looked at me and said, it wasn't in first person, it was third person. But Lee Child had done such a great job of internal monologue in third person through Reacher's viewpoint that I thought I was reading a first person book. So here's my question. As a playwright who has specialized in dialogue for writing other people's lines and listening to your words bouncing back at you, did you transfer that skill from being a playwright into your novel writing? This is your first novel, but it doesn't feel like your first novel. It feels like your 20th. So how were you able to transfer your dialogue skills from the stage to the page?
Well, I thank you for the comparison to Elmore Leonard. I love writing dialogue, and I, for many years, wrote plays, and I developed some skill, I think, in writing dialogue, and I applied it here to the reflecting pool and later on to Headshot. I found it a way to explain characters, expose them to who they are by hearing them talk. And I think that's what we all do. When we meet with somebody, we listen to their voice and we know about them, or we try to. I had to be a little careful because the reflecting pool is an action novel. A great deal is happening, and I didn't want to slow it down. So I had to have a fine balance between just enough dialogue to create character and atmosphere, and not too much to stop the whole action.
An excellent way of looking at it. And when I think about, when you're using dialogue and internal monologue to develop character as well, because the thing you're very good at is different characters don't have the same cadence of speech. I loved the Robert Ludlum novels of the 70s and 80s, but every character sounded like they graduated from Harvard. There was never a character who had an urban twang or anything else. You've got dialects in this book. You've got characters who cut off their pronoun. You've got all kinds of different things, and it really distinguishes the characters. At least I found that it really distinguishes the characters. When you think about where you're going with the next book, and this is something, that I think is going to become a very popular topic for writers. The last time America faced a major crisis was 9/11. And 9/11 changed thrillers forever. It brought them back to life along with the Da Vinci Code. You and I would probably not be having this conversation today if not for the Da Vinci Code and 9/11, which gave us new boogeymen and a renewed interest in the thriller form. Now we have a new crisis. We have COVID. We have basically a paradigm shift in the way we're going to live. How do you think COVID will, it's a two-part question, Otho. How will COVID be treated in thrillers in the post-pandemic age? I'll ask it one at a time. Do you think writers are going to ignore it? Or are we going to have thrillers where people are going to be wearing masks, where they're going to be talking about social distancing, where they're going to be in restaurants where people, or where some of the tables have been removed? Or and you can answer it either in the collective or what you intend to do with COVID. How are you, or what do you think in general or specific as far as the future of the thriller with COVID?
Fortunately for me, I completed the Reflecting Pool and indeed my subsequent novel before the COVID plague hit. And so I didn't have to reflect that. But for the future, any writer who's writing about a contemporary world, rather than say 18th century England or something, yes, he's going to have to take that into account. He or she's going to have to incorporate it somehow, and that's going to be a real challenge, because if you're writing an action novel, which I am, if everybody's at home locked in their own apartments or homes, it's kind of hard to spell that out. So it's going to be really tricky for writers. I haven't tried to address that yet, but I think everybody who writes contemporary fiction is going to have to deal with that.
It's a great point, because another author, his language is different, but he also writes in first person. That's James Lee Burke. And one of the best Dave Roby Show novels James Lee Burke wrote was Post Katrina. And it was almost like a rant, because he hated what had happened to his city. He hated what had happened to the bayou. And he didn't ignore Katrina as many writers would have done. A question came across the screen from someone watching us on Facebook Live, sponsored by Booktrib. And I didn't see all of it because it was cut off, but I think the question was, what made you want to be a writer? I'm not sure. Let me ask the question my way and we'll get to the answer, which is, what made you want to be a writer? That's, Otho, the first part of the question. Part B is, what made you transfer your talent from the stage to the page? Why write a novel? Why not keep writing plays? And what made you want to be a writer in the first place? Let's start with that.
Well, I think that being a writer must be in my genes. As far as I can remember, I've always wanted to be a writer. I've always read lots, and I always fantasized when I was quite young about writing. I wrote in different genres. Started off writing science fiction, short stories. I love writing. I love the challenges of a blank page or a blank screen nowadays. And so it gives me great satisfaction to write. The actual genre or form is secondary. When I retired from the Foreign Service, I decided to write plays because I had been seeing a lot of theater over the years and enjoyed, and still do enjoy, theaters. So I decided to do that. And I sort of learned the trade, so to speak. But I never gave up the idea of doing other things. I think the only genre that I've never really been tempted to do was writing poetry. I think that's beyond me. But when I got a pause in my playwriting, I thought I'd like to do a long form fiction. And as I'm too superficial to do serious fiction, I will decide to do genre fiction, which I thoroughly enjoy.
I think your point about poetry is very interesting. James Dickey was a poet. He gave us Deliverance. James W. Hall was a poet. He's given us the great Thorne novels, which he owns the keys of Florida the way you own Washington, thanks to the Thorne novels, which are also noir, but they're Florida noir, which is a whole nother subject. We're coming to the end, and I want to make sure I get to my favorite part, which is the lightning round. I love to find out a little background about what influenced you as a writer, what inspired you. So when you think about other authors out there, your contemporaries, the ones who you fashion yourself after, what author's work has influenced you the most?
Well, there are obviously a lot of writers that I've read and really enjoyed. Thomas Harris, James Patterson, who writes about Washington, Ken Follett, and of course Lee Child, who you mentioned. But I suppose the fiction that I've read that most identify with are some of the British writers, John le Carré and his major character, and I think I read those years ago, and the stories and the characters and the ambiance sticks with me. And so when I started to decide to do a long form fiction, I wanted to try to achieve some of the effects that those writers had.
What's your favorite? So that gets us, which is interesting because I never would have thought you would say British mysteries, because they're anti-noir.
They are anti-noir.
Le Carré is the polar opposite of what you're doing, and yet the subject matter is similar, because it always ends up political in his books. What about, since you've written a political thriller or a political crime thriller by nature, Washington would be called, it would be a political thriller. What is your favorite political thriller? Or name a couple that you would that compare well to The Reflecting Pool, or that would be that you would want The Reflecting Pool to be shelved with.
Well, I think probably some of the the novels of Graham Greene, which are completely different, but where you often have a main character who is unassuming, as in the case of John le Carré and his spy novels. The main character is unprepossessed, not a hero, not a superhero by any means. He he's surrounded by enemies and dangerous people, and he defeats them through being smarter than they are. And that always just appeals to me.
Such a great point, because many would consider there were many who say the greatest modern political thriller ever written and done as a movie. The movie was 3 Days of the Condor. The book was 6 Days of the Condor by the great James Grady, who's a wonderful guy as well as a fantastic writer. And you just described Condor. He does it with his brains. Even in what I consider to be the greatest political thriller of all time, 7 Days in May, Jiggs Kelly, played by Kirk Douglas in the movie, he may be a Marine war hero, but he never draws a gun. There's no altercations. He figures out what's going on just the way that you just described it. I don't know, with the exception of one murder in all the novels of Drury, Alan Drury, Advise and Consent, and that whole series that he did, if there was ever any action or violence, the characters were always moving with their thoughts. Moving into your other love, your other avocation, playwriting. What's your favorite play of all time?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that question.
I do.
Well, it may come as a shock or a surprise. Medea and the plays of Sophocles and Euripides, King Lear, Oedipus Rex. Right now, they're violent, they're bloody, they're harsh, and that seems to be very appropriate to the time we live in. But those, if I had to pick something out of the blue, those are the ones that I would go back to.
I made a personal bet with myself that you were going to say Death of a Salesman, because Miller's dialogue is so perfect.
Yes.
And I consider it the greatest American play ever written, timeless. I think all great mysteries are timeless. I think that 20 years from now, 25 years from now, when people talk about Washington Noir, they're going to be talking about The Reflecting Pool, and they're going to be talking about Headshot. Love the double entendre with headshot, by the way.
Yeah.
Because it's a photography term, but it's also a headshot. Bang. So you've gotten away. We have been blessed the last half hour speaking here on Facebook Live, brought to you by Booktrib. We've been talking with Otho Eskin, whose first novel, The Reflecting Pool, is now available. There will be a sequel, Headshot. And if you like great detective stories laden with action, surprises, twists, and turns, this is the book for you. The Reflecting Pool by Otho Eskin. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. And we can't wait. I can't wait for Headshot.
Thank you, John, for your very kind words. And I look forward to your next novel.
Yeah. I hopefully my first capital crimes book will be compared to The Reflecting Pool.
Okay, well, all right. Good to talk with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. And that's Facebook Live, presented by Booktrib, the best source anywhere for book news and book reviews.